got a big night in the Big Ten tonight. Only one game, but it is an awfully big one. First of two this year between Indiana and Purdue.
Yeah, huge game. Obviously a big rivalry game for the state of Indiana. Purdue, Indiana doesn't get much better than this in college basketball.
Now, for my money, this is the best basketball rivalry in the Big Ten, which isn't to say there aren't some other great ones. Michigan State, of course, comes to mind. But you just think of how ingrained basketball is in the culture in the state of Indiana. It is, for that reason, our big story today. And as we take a look at this matchup, it's one the Boilers have absolutely owned. They have won the last 9 in a row. The Hoosiers' last victory came in 2016. Purdue's done it primarily with defense, holding the Hoosiers under 40% from the field, under 25% from behind the arc. That winning streak, by the way, 9 in a row, the longest for either side in this series since the mid-1950s. Look, it's a rivalry, Trey, and clearly both of these teams really want to win. And I think sometimes you're splitting hairs when you say, like, who does this mean more to? I mean, from a fan's point of view and from wanting to beat those guys and from a player's point of view, it means a ton to both sides. But if you're looking at it from who needs this more for the arc of their season, I think you could argue Indiana's still looking to build a tourney resume. And for them, this is one of those wins that would resonate in March.
Absolutely. I mean, it would be a statement win, you know, a resume win, just as you mentioned. But one of the things about Indiana that I've been impressed with as of late is their offense, averaging 75 points per game in their last 3 games. I know they lost one of those games, but I really like how they've been playing in transition, playing through Race Thompson a lot more. So I expect this to be a good game tonight. Yeah,
when you talk about their offense, it does feel like there's been a little more tempo to what they do. When I think about Indiana this year and what has made them really competitive and at times really good, I think more about the defense. Do they have a decision to make here? Because you know that Purdue wants to push the pace, right? This is one of the highest scoring teams in the country. They've scored more than 90 points 9 times this year. I mean, it's staggering how good their offense can be. Is there a decision to be made here for Indiana of trying to push the pace with Purdue or trying to slow them down with what has become maybe the Big Ten's best defense, certainly up there?
I think you keep up the pace, right? I think when you're playing at home, you have the momentum, you have the crowd, it's a rivalry game. I think you keep up the pace, you play with tempo, because look, this Indiana team doesn't have like a pure point guard where you could give the just manufacture offense. So the way that they've been successful as of late is getting the ball up in transition. You see Race Thompson getting a steal and a dunk right there. And then you see Xavier Johnson pushing the ball, and the bigs have been doing a great job of running the floor. TJD getting a dunk there. So that's the way this offense has been successful, especially when you don't have a guy that you can kind of just give the ball to and play pick and roll basketball with.
They have been great defensively. And in fact, in Big Ten play, they are number 1 in the Big Ten in defensive efficiency in conference play. And so much of that, to me, is premised on the interior, right, and how good Trayce Jackson-Davis is and how good Race Thompson is. But this is like the ultimate test, right? I mean, this is the honors course when you go up against Purdue and their great big men in that combination of Zach Edey and Travion Williams. How equipped do you think those Indiana bigs are to deal with those guys defensively?
I think the Indiana bigs will be fine. I'm looking at the Indiana wings. You're thinking about Parker Stewart and Miller Kopp. How will they guard Sasha Stefanovic and Jaden Ivey, 2 of the best offensive players in the conference? I think they've improved a lot. I thought earlier in the year, like when you think about Syracuse and some other games, I thought they weren't as strong defensively. But I think Miller Kopp and Parker Stewart have really picked it up on the defensive end. So that's a matchup that I'm looking for tonight.
What about on the other side? We haven't really spoken all that much about Purdue's defense. I mean, it has come out in a couple of their games where they've had subpar performances, and Matt Painter has kind of gone out of his way to say, hey, I told you guys we are not a great defensive team. No one would listen to me. You thought it was just coach speak, and we have seen it manifest itself a couple times. Where do you think the Boilers are on that end of the court?
I think they've improved a lot. I thought against Penn State a few games ago, they were playing hard, but they weren't playing smart defensively. But then in the Nebraska game, they were playing hard and smart, because that's the key. You can play hard on the defensive end, but if you're not rotating right and if you're not sticking to the game plan, then you're still going to give up open opportunities. And I think it really starts with Jaden Ivey. When your star player is pressuring the ball and playing high-level defense, all the other guys have to follow. So I think it starts with him. It starts with guys like Eric Hunter. I think they're getting more ball pressure, and I think that's been the key to Purdue's success on the defensive end.
Is it hard sometimes when you're as good as they are offensively? I mean, they're literally the most efficient offense in the country. And so you're a team, as I said, you've scored more than 90 points 9 times. You have so many great weapons. Is it hard to buy in on that defensive end? I mean, do you think that's part of what it is, or are we just dealing with guys who, for whatever reason, are not the type of defenders we typically see at Purdue?
No, absolutely. I think it's harder to buy in when you know that you can make up for it on the offensive end. But Purdue learned against Johnny Davis in Wisconsin, if you don't play defense and if you let a star player, get to their favorite shot, be able to be productive on the offensive end, you can lose games. And so I think losing ultimately is the greatest lesson to make you play defense.
Yeah, absolutely. What about this notion of kind of momentum here for Purdue? Like, they went in on Monday and beat what I think is a fabulous Illinois team in double overtime in a game that had to take a ton out of them. I mean, it was a thrilling game. It was an exhausting game. It was one of the best games I've seen in a long time. And so you had that challenge on the road, and now you go to Indiana where you know they're going to be fired up and ready to go. Is this something where you're riding a wave of momentum, or is this something where it's challenging to get up for 2 games of that magnitude on the road consecutively?
For me personally as a player, it was challenging. When you have that high-intensity game, obviously going up against a great Illinois team, and then to come back and play another emotional game, it is really hard as a player because Indiana is going to be ready. They played against a weaker opponent in Nebraska, so they're hyped up for this game. So I personally think it's going to be harder to get up for this game, but I expect that Purdue, through the course of the game, will kind of get a rhythm, and it'll be a good game.
And Mike Woodson has put incredible emphasis on winning at home, defending their home court. They're 11-0 at Simon Scott Assembly Hall this year, so we'll see whether or not they can continue that. Plenty more on this game coming up. As I said off the top, we are going to talk to beat writers from both sides on this game, but I do want to get to the one game last night in the Big Ten. It was controversial, to say the least. A defensive struggle. Rutgers topping Iowa 48-46. Scarlet Knights shot 31%. They hit 2 of 13 from 3. They hit 7 of their 22 layups, and they won. And they did so by holding Iowa a full 40 points under its season scoring average. Again, the game ended with a very controversial foul call. We're going to get into that in a moment. But how big a win was this for Rutgers?
It's huge. It's huge because now all of a sudden you have a tournament resume, right? And the thing I think with this Rutgers team, early on in the year, they weren't playing Rutgers basketball. When you think about when Steve Peichel took over this program, it was about toughness, scrappiness, physicality. And I thought earlier in the year they weren't doing that. The games were in the 80s. They gave up like 85 to Massachusetts, gave up 86 to Illinois. Now all of a sudden the games are in the 60s. I mean, last night it was in the 40s, right?
Yeah,
so that's ultimately that's Rutgers basketball. They don't shoot a high percentage, but they force their opponents to shoot a low percentage as well. So that's their key to success. Ron Harper Jr., obviously a star player, but when you have a star player and then you have that defensive intensity, it's going to go well for you in the Big Ten.
The level of pride that they take in it, right, and kind of embracing the notion of this is who we are, this is our identity. I thought they did an amazing job on Keegan Murray. We talked a lot this week about how you defend star players. I did the Wisconsin-Northwestern game, and Chris Collins was saying if you can get a 1-to-1 shot-to-point ratio, and I know Rayfeld Davis has talked a lot about that. They did that last night. In fact, they did one better. He had 13 points on 14 shots. What did you see from the way that they defended Keegan Murray?
Well, Iowa in general, right, they love to get out in transition and get easy baskets. And I thought Rutgers did a really good job of what's called building a wall. So when they're running in transition and Keegan Murray has the ball in transition, Rutgers built a wall so that Keegan Murray had no driving lanes and no ability to penetrate. Every time Keegan Murray had the ball, he was pressured. And then if he did get by his defender, there was another guy there to take away his driving lane. So I thought that was the key to Rutgers' success on the defensive end.
Really did a fabulous job. And as you say, they're starting to build a tourney resume. Unfortunately, you mentioned the UMass game. They lost to Lafayette as well. I mean, their RPI, or their net, I should say, almost got stuck in the pass there. Their net ranking is still over 100. It's 105. So, look, they still have a lot of work to do, but they have a very favorable schedule here going forward where they can build up this record over the next 4 games or so. And then, we'll see when they hit that difficult stretch, if we can pluck off a couple more of those. I mean, it's a team that's already beaten Purdue at home. We'll see whether Rutgers can get themselves into that conversation. I said it, this game did have some serious controversy associated with it. The final play of the game, for all intents and purposes, the deciding play of the game, right here, you see Ron Harper Jr. working on Keegan Murray and a foul called there. You see the tweet from our buddy Mike DeCourcy and, basically saying, I think I just saw the worst foul call non-Charbage division. This reference to block charge, which drives Mike particularly crazy. In 50 years of covering basketball, Fran McCaffrey incredulous there. What did you see on that call?
I mean, there's no way of putting it. It was a terrible call, right? I mean, I think the ref would say it himself, and that's just the way basketball works sometimes, especially when you're on the road. But I think if you're Fran McCaffrey, you kind of got to let that go and try to figure out what got you into that position in the first place. And I know that he will do that because that's what great coaches do. You don't focus on a call. You focus on the other 39 minutes and 50 seconds of the game and why you weren't able to have success on the offensive end.
I was surprised at how restrained Fran was after the game. Maybe you're at a certain point where you just throw up your hands. I mean, there's literally nothing you can do. I think it is disturbing. It's the second night in the Big Ten we have seen a game come down to the wire and have a very controversial call, both of them by the same official, unfortunately, and a game just. You hate to see a game decided in that way, Trey, and I am with you. To a certain extent, you can make the argument that the rest of the game, there was little things that could have been done here and there where you're not in that spot, right? And so you can say, well, it wasn't that whistle that lost in the game. However, had the whistle not blown, right, we go to overtime, and it's a coin flip. So, I mean, you also can make the argument that was what lost them the game. Again, I just hate to see it. I hate to see it, unfortunately, dominate the Twitter timeline and dominate the discussion because no one wants to see officiating be the story. And these guys work really hard and by and large do great jobs. But you can't make yourself the story as an official. And I guess I just don't understand. Like, to me, it has to be egregious at that point of the game. It has to be obvious, not egregious, but obvious that it's a foul, right?
I think so. And, it's tough. It's really tough. There's really I always was a player, right, that if I was so focused on the officials, it threw off my game. So for me personally, I'm thinking about strategy. I'm thinking about how can myself as a player get better? How can our team get better? Iowa had 0 points off their bench last night. So I think that's something you have to address. I'm just of the mindset, if I'm focused on the officials, it's going to hurt my play down the line.
And I agree with you 100%. And again, I think there are certain things that are within your control and certain things that are not within your control. And the healthiest way to approach any of this stuff is, what can we control? That being said, it's just got to be better. Like, you just don't.
You're right.
You just don't want to see that. You just don't want to see that. It's disappointing and frustrating because I think the general consensus is officials should decide games. And that play, for better or for worse, did decide the last 10 seconds of that game and ultimately the results of it. Bruce Feldman of The Athletic and Fox Sports, occasional guest here on Big Ten Today, tweeting last night, quote, sources inside Michigan think Jim Harbaugh would take the Las Vegas Raiders job if offered. An accompanying article there adding the caveat that all of the sources mentioned how hard Harbaugh can be to read. And this on the heels of an article from Nick Baumgardner and Austin Meek, also on The Athletic. It came out yesterday that said, among other things, quote, Michigan, per sources, has had productive conversations with Harbaugh, yet, per sources, there's still some in high-ranking university positions who wonder if the head coach is torn between staying at Michigan or perhaps returning to the NFL. This shouldn't be confused with the notion that Harbaugh is weighing an active NFL offer. Instead, the question, at least for his bosses at Michigan, is what he'll do if or when one shows up during a coaching carousel cycle that is hardly over. So what in the heck is going on here? Nick Baumgardner joins us now. And Nick, let's start here. The Raiders need to want him for him to leave, right? Like, you need to have an NFL offer in order to take an NFL coaching job. What is your sense of the level of interest emanating from Las Vegas?
That's the hardest thing. No one really knows. We even talked to the guys here that cover, the Raiders for us at The Athletic, and I think they're even scratching their heads, but with the admission that, if there's anybody in football that's sort of like Jim Harbaugh in terms of like, I'm not going to tip my hand at what I'm thinking, it's Mark Davis. So, we know that there's a fondness there. Once a Raider, always a Raider. Al Davis loved Jim Harbaugh. He gave him his first job as a coach. And I think that that's always been something that has tied those two places together, one place and one person or whatever together. But in terms of how deep that is, or if there's an offer coming and he knows about it, then he's not telling anybody else. And that's the big question is, does he have an offer? Is he going to get one? Does he have an interview? Is he going to get one? If that happens, then the story changes, pretty quickly, as Bruce alluded to in what he wrote yesterday.
Yeah, that's what's fascinating. I mean, we're talking, the guy is like almost 20 years removed from being the Raiders quarterback coach for two seasons, and yet there's all this discussion of the ties there. To me, and maybe it's parochial because I'm a Bears fan, I live in Chicago, right? He was the quarterback of the Bears for 7 years. There was a report this past week of a brief phone conversation between Harbaugh and the Bears from someone who is very well connected within the Bears organization. I mean, a brief phone conversation. I mean, maybe it's the wrong number. I mean, you just have no idea what's going on here. But why aren't the Bears more of a player in this, or are they? I mean, what do we know about Chicago?
Yeah, I don't know that one. I mean, that's one too. I've heard, people have asked me about New York, Miami. Of course, Miami being Stephen Ross, and Stephen Ross already said, as he does every year, that I'm not hiring Jim Harbaugh away. I think there are people in the Giants organization that have a fondness for Jim Harbaugh. Yeah, a lot of it comes back to, does the ownership have a fondness for Jim Harbaugh or not? Because he is a unique coach and he is a challenging coach to work with, as his last, his tenure in San Francisco showed. I mean, he won a lot of games, but it did not end well. And it was rocky, and he had to work with the GM. And if he goes back to the league now, as I understand it, I think he knows that he's going to have to work with a GM or president or something. It can't just be his show. So when you talk about Harbaugh in the NFL, it's not just, well, look at his record. There's a lot that has to be discussed there, I think. And so that's why this is always interesting. It's like, how many teams actually are interested in him, or are they interested in the idea of it? And that's it. And sometimes it never gets beyond that, in my experience. But, in this case, we'll see.
Now, one of the things that's so interesting about NFL coaching and when they're interviewing candidates is, if you are interviewing someone who is employed in the NFL, you have to let everyone know that you're interviewing him, right? It's a very transparent process. You don't have to do that with a college coach. There is no obligation to say, we are interviewing this person. But what is Jim Harbaugh's obligation, as best you understand it, to keep Michigan in the loop in terms of what's going on?
Glad you asked that. We actually wrote that in the story. And I have not seen this in any Michigan contract prior to. I've been covering for more than a decade. But it's in the contract. The clause is in there that says if he gets an interview or an offer from another team and conducts the interview without telling Michigan, then I believe he can be fired for cause. That was written into this past contract. It is my understanding that Ward Manuel and Michigan have no intent in firing him and don't expect that to happen. But I think that the fact that that was written into the contract tells you that they thought it was possible that he could maybe conduct an interview without them knowing. So, contractually, he is obligated to tell them, if he's interviewing somewhere, if he has an offer somewhere that he's weighing. That was written into the last deal that he signed. And, those are things right now that I think are still sort of like people don't quite have a great grasp on, because he's just not talking. He's recruiting and he's not addressing it. And, that's also pretty classic Jim Harbaugh, I'd say.
Why do you believe, if in fact he is at least entertaining the possibility of leaving, why do you believe that would be happening now? I mean, it seems to me, here you are, you're coming off this great year. You proved everyone wrong. You've got momentum in your program. You have slayed the giant that was Ohio State. And now, people consider you to be a legitimate national title contender again. Why now?
I think this is similar to a little bit of what we saw. It's not the same, but a little bit of what we saw with when Michigan lost John Beilein to the NBA. In that I think that this is a person who is, he's now approaching. He's not quite 60. I think he's 58, going on 59 here next December. So he just turned 58. I think that this is the stage of his career, maybe where he's taken a look at everything and where do I want to go? College football is changing a ton as we see. It's going to, it changed so much in the last 5 years, Dave, and we know that in the next 10 could be unfathomable. And I think that if there's anything torn there, it's probably him. I don't want to speak for him because you really can't, but it's probably him questioning, do I want to continue on in college football? Do I have what I need to do all the things that I'm going to need to do as a college coach with where this game is going? Or do I want to just go back to the NFL and just worry about coaching football and that's it? And I think that might be a question that is floating around in his head right now. And he just won a Big Ten title, as you said. He just beat Ohio State, as you said. Might never have a better chance to strike. And I think that he's trying to see if anything will strike. I think that's part of what's happening too. And I think Michigan's giving him the space to explore that. How much space is what was last year too? And it remains to be seen again this year.
He took a very public pay cut.
He did.
Before last season, and there was a ton written about it, and he had to prove himself. And I will say this, I thought he was great about it in terms of his public face. I mean, not only was he, saying all the right things, but then when he got some of those bonuses, he ended up giving them away.
Gave them all back.
Yeah, right. I mean, to former athletic department employees. So, I mean, it's really remarkable the way that he handled it. And so I think maybe naively, I sat here and said, man, he was fine with it. Is it possible, though, that somewhere deep inside there's some residual resentment here from that he lost some face in all of this and that somehow that soured him on Michigan?
Yeah, I do think that if they are back and if he's back at Michigan and they, further along with this relationship, then that's something that they're going to have to talk about probably and explore, because I do question that. I do question it. And Jim has said that it didn't bother him. But I mean, Jim said it didn't bother him in the way that you say that things that clearly bother you didn't bother you. I brushed it off and I moved on and I won a Big Ten title. That was Jim's response. And I think it did bother him. I think it bothered him, and I think it showed, or in his mind anyway, that, they weren't fully trusting him the way they once were. I don't know if I would fully agree with all that, but, that's his prerogative. And I do think that if they are back, that's something that will have to probably be monitored, because yeah, they did give him a big pay cut, and he responded by doing the thing that they told him he wasn't doing immediately. So it's, it took an awkward situation and maybe made it a little more awkward. But, at this point, I think maybe all cards have to be on the table and everybody has to start making decisions for what they want to do long term. And that includes Michigan, too. I think they've had to probably think about what life's going to be like without Jim Harbaugh more than they did last year, more than they have at any other point. So, I think that's part of the conversation as well.
One of the things that also I've been thinking about a little bit in terms of why he would consider this move now is, as good as they were this year, and we kind of use that in one sense to justify, well, why wouldn't you want to come back after everything went as well as it did? You get to that Orange Bowl, and as you well know, Nick, I mean, they were completely dominated there. And so is it possible that he looks at this and says, I'm not sure how much better I can get it? We beat Ohio State. We won the Big Ten. We kind of restored the pride of Michigan football. Yet, man, we still have a really long way to go to compete with the team that ended up winning the national title. I mean, it was a complete mismatch. Right. And so might that be part of it? Might that factor into his thought process?
I think it's part of it, but I don't think it's a reason that he would want to leave. I think the conversation that they have there is that we all need to, that we being he and Michigan, they need to be better in general with NIL and making sure that everything is on the level, like I think a lot of schools do. And I also think for Jim, it's a question for him the same way as it is with recruiting. Like NIL, I think requires coaches and administrators and players and everybody else to sort of give time that they previously weren't giving to people that are offering money for these things that, now present different challenges and different, questions on your time. So I think that that's also a question for, Jim Harbaugh of, hey, you're going to have to be involved in this. How much do you want to be involved in this? And how much do you want to kind of get down there and see what happens with all of this? Because it's going to be huge. The NIL thing is going to be the biggest part of recruiting, as we know, in college football over the next 5 to 10 years. And for him, I think it's going to be a question of, are you ready to go all in on this? Because it's not a question of if, you have to. There's no choice. So I think all things there are being discussed, but I do think that they're all on the same page and that they agree that it's necessary for all parties to max it out and be as good as they can there. And I think Michigan could actually be very good in that space if all hands are sort of pulling in the same direction.
No doubt. That part of it is really fascinating. You made the point earlier, and I agree with you 100%. I think the job of a college head coach has changed more dramatically here in the last 2 or 3 years than probably in the previous 20. So it is a very different job. Again, he outwardly is doing everything that you would expect him to do. He's out recruiting. He hired a new defensive line coach. So yeah, and there's no external signs that he is leaving, but the internal buzz is really fascinating. Nick, I don't know that we solved anything. I don't know that we got to the bottom of this, but it was fun to talk to you and pick your brain about it. Really good reporting on this story.
Appreciate it, Dave. Always a good time.
Yep.